Everett, are you telling me to leave the hotel tonight? Amara Bell stood in the corridor and watched her husband close the door in her face. For 12 years, she had believed this quiet, composed man was the only family she needed. Then the front desk called her back for a forgotten bag, and she opened the wrong door by mistake. On a low table sat a framed photograph draped in black cloth. She pulled the cloth away with 2 fingers. Her blood went cold. It was her own face staring back at her, printed beneath a single line of type: funeral service for Amara Bell, this Friday, 10 in the morning. It was only Wednesday. Amara did not move for a long moment. The hallway carpet muffled every sound except her own breathing. She thought back over the last few hours, searching for the point where the ground had shifted beneath her. Everett had just told her, without raising his voice, that she needed to leave the hotel immediately. No explanation, no argument, no time to collect her suitcase from the room they shared. What frightened her most was not his tone. It was the absence of anger, the terrible calm of a man who had already made his decision days ago and was simply executing it now. They had come to this hotel to celebrate 12 years of marriage. It was Everett's idea, booked months in advance, a suite with a view of the water and a bottle of wine he had chosen himself. But something had changed that morning. He had taken 3 calls in the bathroom with the fan running. He refused to show her the day's schedule, which was unlike him, since he usually planned their anniversaries down to the last reservation. He steered her away from the east wing of the hotel twice, claiming it was closed for renovation, though she had seen guests walking in and out all afternoon. By evening, his patience had worn thin in a way she had never witnessed in 12 years of marriage. He told her, flatly, that she had to go. She asked him where she was supposed to go at this hour, with no car and no plan. He answered that it did not matter, as long as it was not here. That single sentence told her something had broken that could not be repaired with an apology in the morning. This was not a fight born of tiredness or wine. This felt like a decision made about her. Not with her, the way a company might decide to close a branch office. She went down to the lobby with nothing but her coat and her phone. Celeste Rowan, the hotel's general manager, caught her near the elevators and mentioned, almost apologetically, that housekeeping had found Amara's overnight bag still sitting in the room. Everett had checked into that afternoon. A separate room Amara had not known existed until that moment. Celeste offered to have someone bring it down. Amara said she would get it herself, and something in her voice made Celeste hesitate before handing over the spare keycard without quite meaning to. The door was not fully latched when Amara reached it. She told herself she only wanted the bag, nothing more, and for a moment that was true. But as she stepped inside, a second keycard slid off the entry table and clattered to the floor, and through the connecting door beside it, she saw that the adjoining room was open as well. It was a room Everett had reserved under a name that was not his own, a detail she would only understand later. She pushed the door wider than she meant to. That was when she saw the frame on the low table, angled toward the window as if someone had been arranging it earlier that day. She crossed the room slowly, the way a person walks towards something they already suspect will hurt them. The black cloth over the glass looked deliberate, almost ceremonial, and her hand was shaking before she even touched it. When the fabric fell away, she was looking at her own smiling photograph, the one from 3 years ago at a friend's wedding, the one Everett had once said was his favorite. Beneath it, in small, elegant type, was a date that had not yet arrived. Amara did not touch the photograph right away. She made herself stand still and look at it the way she might look at a contract before signing, cataloging every detail, instead of reacting to any of them. The print was professional, not something run off a home printer, the kind of quality a funeral home orders when a family wants something dignified for the guest book table. Her full legal name was printed beneath the image, along with the name of a chapel she had never visited, and a date only 2 days away. What frightened her most was that the photograph itself looked recent, cropped and color-corrected within the last few weeks, not pulled from an old album the way a hastily assembled memorial might be. Beside the frame sat a folder, thin and unlabeled, the kind of folder that holds paperwork nobody is supposed to read twice. Amara opened it with 2 fingers, as though it might still be warm from whoever had last touched it. The first page was a life insurance policy, bearing her name, and a sum large enough to make her stomach tighten. The second page listed property: the house on Larkspur Lane, the lake cabin, a parcel of land near her mother's old address that she had forgotten Everett even knew about. The third page was a summary of bank accounts, some she recognized and one she did not. The fourth page was a power of attorney form, already signed at the bottom, in a signature that looked almost, but not quite, like her own. She began to understand, slowly, and then all at once, that this was not a prank or a morbid joke between old friends. Someone had been preparing for her death with the same care a person plans a wedding, choosing fonts, choosing dates, choosing which accounts to fold into which other accounts. What she still did not know was whether they intended to make the world believe she was dead or whether they intended to make it true. The distance between those two possibilities felt very small, standing alone in that room, and it was closing fast. She thought, briefly and absurdly, of the wedding photograph that used to sit on their mantel at home, the one where Everett's hand rested on the small of her back, as though he were steadying her rather than holding her in place. She had always read that gesture as protection. Standing in a stranger's hotel room with a stranger's funeral plans laid out in front of her, she wondered how many other gestures she had misread in exactly the same way, how many acts of apparent care had simply been the quiet maintenance of something he intended to keep and eventually collect. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, unhurried, familiar in their rhythm even through a closed door. Amara reached the light switch before her mind had fully caught up with her hand, and the room went dark just as the door handle turned. Everett stood in the frame of the open doorway for a moment, scanning the darkness, apparently unaware that his wife was pressed against the wall behind the connecting door, only a few feet from where he stood. He did not turn on the light. Instead, he pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and made a call, his voice pitched low in the particular register people use when they assume they are alone. "No," he said. "She hasn't left the hotel yet." A pause followed, long enough that Amara could hear her own pulse in her ears. Then he spoke again, quieter this time, almost gentle, the way he used to sound when he told her good news. "If she's seen the file, we have to move the timeline up." Amara felt something in her chest go very still, colder than fear, closer to recognition. He had not said I, he had said we. And that single word told her there was someone else standing behind him in every decision he had made about her life, someone she had not yet met and could not yet name. Everett left as quickly as he had arrived, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft click that seemed almost considerate. Amara waited a full 60 seconds before she moved, counting them silently the way she used to count contractions before either of her miscarriages, a habit her body apparently never unlearned. She switched the light back on just long enough to photograph 3 pages from the folder with her phone, her hands steadier now than they had any right to be. As she turned to leave, one line near the bottom of the insurance summary caught her eye and would not let go. It read, in plain black text, projected date of death, Friday. She checked the clock on the nightstand. It was Wednesday evening. She had less than 48 hours before whatever had been planned for her would arrive on schedule, whether she was ready for it or not. She did not call the police that night. She turned the thought over more than once, standing in the stairwell with her phone warm in her hand. But she kept arriving at the same conclusion. She did not yet know what Everett actually intended to do, and if this was a real conspiracy rather than a cruel scare, alerting anyone too early might only give the people involved time to erase what little evidence existed. She needed the whole plan before she could safely move against any part of it, and that meant she needed allies who had no reason to protect her husband. She found Celeste near the front desk, still finishing her shift, and asked, as casually as her voice could manage, whether the hotel kept camera footage of the guest room hallways. Something in Amara's face must have told Celeste this was not an idle question, because she led her to a small office behind the concierge desk without a single follow-up. Together they scrolled through 2 days of grainy footage, and one detail surfaced almost immediately. Everett had met the same unfamiliar man 3 separate times over the previous 2 days, always in a corner of the lobby near the service elevator, always carrying a slim gray briefcase that never seemed to leave his hand. Celeste checked the guest registry and confirmed the man had never checked into a room of his own, which meant he had come only to meet Everett and then left again each time. Amara asked if there was a name attached to any of the calls or messages the front desk had logged for her husband's room, and after a moment of hesitation that suggested a small violation of policy, Celeste gave her one. Marcus Vale. The name landed like a stone, dropped into still water, because Amara knew it well. Marcus had once been Everett's financial attorney, a sharp, careful man who had handled the incorporation of Everett's company years before Amara had even learned to spell the names of the funds he managed. She remembered, too, the story Everett used to tell about him at dinner parties, always with the same bitter edge, about how Marcus had betrayed him and walked away from their partnership without warning. She had never questioned that version of events, because she had never had a reason to. Now she found herself wondering why a man Everett claimed to despise would be meeting him in secret, 3 times in 2 days, carrying a briefcase he guarded like it held something that could not be replaced. She wondered why her own insurance paperwork was sitting untouched in a hotel room, registered under a stranger's name. The questions were multiplying faster than she could hold them. She borrowed a phone from the concierge desk and dialed the number Celeste had given her, her heart beating hard enough that she was certain it would be audible through the receiver. Marcus did not want to speak over the line, not even to confirm his own name, and for a moment she thought he might simply hang up. Instead, he said only one sentence, low and urgent, that if she was truly Amara Bell, she should meet him at the old chapel behind the hotel grounds within the hour. She went without telling anyone where she was headed, because at that point she was no longer certain who among the hotel staff might already be reporting her movements to someone else. The chapel had not been used for services in years, its pews dusty and its stained glass dark against the evening sky, and Marcus was already waiting inside when she arrived. He studied her for a long moment before speaking, as though checking her against some memory of a photograph he had seen recently, and what he said chilled her more than anything Everett had done that day. He told her he had genuinely believed, walking in, that she would not still be alive to meet him. When she asked what he knew, he handed her a plain envelope, instead of answering directly, and inside it were photocopies of wire transfers she had never authorized, moving significant sums into a shell company whose final listed beneficiary, astonishingly, was Amara Bell herself, under a signature she had never signed. Marcus told her, flatly, that her husband was building a version of her that could die on schedule so that everything real underneath it could quietly change hands. Before she could ask her next question, his eyes moved past her shoulder toward the chapel door, and his voice dropped to something closer to a warning. The plan, he said, had not started with Everett at all, and someone was standing behind her husband in every sense of that phrase, someone Amara had not yet even considered. Sitting in the dim chapel, Amara found herself running back through 12 years of marriage like a woman rereading a book she suddenly suspected had been translated wrong from the very first page. Small moments she had once dismissed as ordinary now looked deliberate under this new light. Everett had asked her, more than once, to sign what he called routine tax documents, always late at night, always with a pen already in her hand before she had finished reading the page. He had told her early on that she did not need to understand the family investments, that this was simply his role in their marriage, and hers was elsewhere. He had gently persuaded her to sell a small property she had inherited from her grandmother, arguing it made no sense to maintain 2 households' worth of upkeep. He had also encouraged her, gently and then not so gently, to leave the career she had built for nearly a decade, framing it always as an act of love rather than control. "The family needs you here," he used to say, and she had believed him, because believing him had always been easier than questioning him. Sitting across from Marcus now, she understood for the first time how thoroughly she had been cut off from the financial architecture of her own life, one reasonable-sounding request at a time, until she owned almost nothing that was not also somehow his to manage. Marcus revealed something larger than Amara had prepared herself for. Everett, it turned out, had been quietly drowning in debt for nearly 2 years, the kind of debt that could dissolve a business and a reputation in the same afternoon if it ever became public. Of the 2 of them, Amara held the cleanest assets in the marriage, property and accounts, untouched by the mess Everett had made of his own finances. He had spent months, Marcus said, converting what belonged to her into something he could later claim as an inheritance rather than a theft. But that explanation alone did not account for the funeral photograph, the chapel booking, the date already chosen. A theft did not require a death. A death required something else entirely. Marcus produced one more document from his briefcase. A life insurance contract with a payout large enough to erase Everett's debt several times over, provided Amara died within a very specific window of time. There was, however, a complication buried in the fine print. Amara had apparently changed the listed beneficiary several months earlier, a change she had absolutely no memory of making. When she said so, Marcus did not look surprised. He told her, quietly, that someone had forged her signature on that document, someone with intimate enough access to her handwriting and her routines to make the forgery convincing. She asked him who. He would not say the name outright. He only told her that whoever it was had once lived inside her own house. Before Amara could press him further, his phone buzzed against the pew, and whatever appeared on the screen drained the color from his face almost instantly. He said they needed to leave immediately, his voice suddenly stripped of the careful control he had maintained since she arrived. It was already too late. Through the chapel's narrow window, Amara saw headlights sweep across the gravel outside, and she recognized the car before she recognized the shape of the man stepping out of it. Everett had found them, and in the half-second before he opened the chapel door, Amara understood with total clarity that her husband already knew exactly where she had been all evening. She did not run, though every instinct told her to. Running would have confirmed everything Everett suspected and stripped her of the one advantage she still had, which was that he did not yet know how much she had learned. Instead, she slipped out through the chapel's side door, while Marcus created a brief, convincing distraction near the front, and by the time Everett reached the pews, she was already halfway back toward the hotel, composing her face into something calm on the walk. When he found her 20 minutes later in the lobby, she was sitting near the fireplace with a magazine she was not reading, as though she had never left the building at all. What followed was one of the more difficult performances of her life. Everett approached her slowly, and something in his posture had softened again, the tenderness returning like a tide he could summon at will. He apologized for the way he had spoken to her earlier, blaming stress from work, blaming the anniversary itself for putting too much pressure on both of them. He wrapped his arms around her, the way he had 1,000 times before, and for one disorienting second, her body remembered only the comfort of those 12 years. Before her mind caught up and reminded her what she now knew, she let him hold her. She even let herself lean into it slightly, because a woman who suspected nothing would not have pulled away. Later that evening, testing the boundaries of what she could ask without raising suspicion, she posed a question that had been circling her mind since the chapel. She asked him, in a voice pitched somewhere between idle curiosity and old marital habit, what he would do if she died. Everett went still for exactly 1 second, a pause so brief that a stranger might have missed it entirely. But Amara had spent 12 years learning the grammar of his silences. He recovered quickly and told her he could not imagine living without her, his voice smooth and convincing in the way that only years of practice could produce. She smiled at him and said nothing more, though inside she was already cataloging the lie for later use. That night, once his breathing had settled into the rhythm of real sleep, Amara set a small recording device on the nightstand of the adjoining room she now knew existed. Angled toward the wall, she shared with whatever conversations he still believed were private. In the early hours of the morning, she heard him leave the bed and dial someone from the hallway just outside their door. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman, sharp and businesslike, someone Amara did not recognize, but whose name emerged clearly enough through the thin door. Vivian Cross asked him, without preamble, whether Amara knew yet. Everett answered simply that she did not. Vivian pressed further, asking what would happen if Amara somehow found out before the plan could be completed. And Everett's answer arrived without a trace of hesitation, delivered in the same even tone he might use to discuss a dinner reservation. By Friday, he said, she won't have the chance to say anything at all. Amara sat frozen on the edge of the bed, the recorder still running, absorbing a sentence that confirmed everything she had feared, and somehow still managed to be worse when spoken aloud in her husband's own voice. But the conversation was not finished, and what came next unsettled her even more than the threat itself. Vivian asked, almost carelessly, whether he was certain Amara was even the right choice for this. And after a long pause, Everett answered that she was never meant to be anything more than a means to an end, a stand-in. Amara sat with that word for a long time after the call ended, turning it over until its full meaning finally settled into place. She was not the target of this plan at all. She was only a piece of something considerably larger, and she still did not know what that larger thing was. By morning, Amara had decided that Vivian Cross deserved more attention than a name overheard through a hotel wall. Using nothing but her phone and the sliver of information Marcus had already given her, she pieced together that Vivian had once been a business partner of Everett's, involved in an early venture that had quietly folded years before Amara had ever heard its name mentioned. What she found more interesting than the partnership itself was the pattern beneath it, a series of transactions that suggested Vivian had lost a significant amount of money to Everett rather than beside him, and that the loss had never been resolved in any way that looked voluntary. It became clear to Amara, the more she read, that Vivian was not a willing accomplice so much as a woman being quietly blackmailed with her own financial history, someone Everett had learned to control the same way he had learned to control his wife, just with different pressure points. Armed with this theory, and very little else, Amara arranged to meet Vivian directly, choosing a public coffee shop 2 blocks from the hotel, where neither of them could easily be overheard. Vivian arrived defensive and sharp-edged, clearly assuming Amara already knew everything and had come only to accuse her. The confrontation nearly ended before it began, both women talking past each other in short, clipped sentences, until Amara finally set her phone on the table and played a portion of the recording from the night before. Something in Vivian's posture collapsed the moment Everett's voice reached the phrase stand-in, as though she too had never fully understood what role she was playing in his design. She admitted, quietly and without much resistance left in her, that Everett was engineering a fraudulent bankruptcy behind the scenes, and that Amara's death, real or convincingly staged, was meant to serve as the mechanism that made the surrounding money disappear without a trace. But there was a second layer to the plan that Vivian revealed almost as an afterthought, as though it had only recently become clear to her as well. Everett intended to use Amara's supposed death to permanently attach every financial irregularity to her name instead of his own, constructing a paper trail that would suggest she had been embezzling for years before her untimely passing. Once she was gone, there would be no one left to contradict the story. And a dead woman cannot defend her own reputation in a courtroom. Amara realized, sitting in that coffee shop with her hands wrapped tightly around a cup she had stopped drinking from, that Everett wanted more from her than money or property. He wanted her money, her assets, and her good name. And beyond all of that, he wanted permanent authorship over the story of how she died, a version of events no one would ever be able to challenge again. Amara sat with that realization longer than she meant to, watching the foam settle on top of her forgotten coffee, while the coffee shop around her continued its ordinary noise, cups clinking, someone laughing near the register, a life going on as though nothing had shifted. It struck her that this was the particular cruelty of what Everett had built. It was not loud enough to be called violence in the way most people understood the word. No raised fists, no shouted threats, only spreadsheets and signatures and a photograph chosen with real care. A quiet kind of erasure, engineered so patiently that by the time anyone thought to question it, there would be nothing left to question. Vivian offered one more piece before the conversation ended, almost as a peace offering, mentioning that the funeral photograph itself had come from an event planning company Everett had quietly hired weeks earlier. Amara asked who had actually placed the order, since Everett rarely handled such details personally, and Vivian pulled up an old email thread on her phone to check. The name attached to the request was not Everett's at all. It belonged to Dr. Nolan Pierce, the same physician who had overseen Everett's health for years and who Amara had always considered, however distantly, something close to a family friend. Amara found Dr. Nolan Pierce at his private office late that afternoon, arriving without an appointment and refusing to be turned away by the receptionist who tried politely to reschedule her. When she finally stood across the desk from him, he denied any involvement at first, his voice, carrying the same practiced calm doctors use to deliver difficult diagnoses. But Amara had come prepared this time, laying the email Vivian had shown her flat on his desk, along with the photographs of the funeral paperwork from the hotel room, and watching his composure crack in real time. Within minutes, Nolan admitted the truth in a low, defeated voice that made him sound years older than he had a moment before. Everett had approached him months earlier, he explained, asking him to prepare falsified medical documentation that could support a very specific and very quiet plan. Amara was to be sedated using a substance that would leave no obvious trace in a routine examination, then transported to a location Everett controlled entirely, away from hotel cameras and away from anyone who might ask questions. From there, an unidentified body already secured through channels Nolan refused to specify would be used to complete the illusion of her death, with falsified medical records supplying whatever official confirmation the situation required. The funeral, disturbingly, had been arranged well in advance of any of this actually happening, planned with the same precision as a corporate product launch. But Nolan revealed something that had shifted only recently, a detail that made the danger facing Amara considerably worse than even Marcus had suggested. Everett, sensing that his wife had begun asking questions no innocent woman would think to ask, had apparently decided the elaborate staging was no longer safe or necessary. He no longer wanted the appearance of her death. He wanted the real thing, delivered quietly enough that no formal investigation would ever need to look past the surface of a tragic accident. Nolan, visibly shaken by his own complicity, reached into a locked drawer and handed Amara a small flash drive, telling her it contained everything he had documented as insurance against exactly this outcome. Before she left his office, Amara asked Nolan one more question, the one that had been sitting beneath all the others since the storage unit revealed his old signature. She asked how long, exactly, he had known Everett, and whether their friendship had ever been real or simply useful. Nolan did not answer right away. He looked down at his own hands for a long moment, the hands of a man who had spent decades healing people, and said quietly that he had told himself for years it was both, that a friendship could still be genuine, even while it was also being used, though he no longer believed that the way he once had. It was not the apology Amara had wanted, but it was, she suspected, the most honest thing he had said to her in 12 years. Amara opened the files later that night, in the privacy of a rented car parked several blocks from the hotel, scrolling through financial records, contract copies, Everett's travel schedule for the coming days, and a list of names she did not fully recognize yet, but suspected she soon would. Near the end of the folder sat a video file, unlabeled, and when she opened it, her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. It showed Everett in quiet conversation with someone whose face was clearly visible in the frame, someone speaking with the same measured confidence Marcus had used in the chapel only hours before. It was Marcus Vale himself, sitting across from her husband, apparently coordinating some part of this plan in language that sounded far too comfortable to belong to a man who claimed he had only recently discovered what Everett intended. Amara watched the video twice, then a third time, searching for some detail that might soften what she was seeing, some context that would explain away the ease with which Marcus spoke to the man he had warned her about only hours earlier. She found no such detail. What she found instead was the uncomfortable certainty that one of the two men who had shown her kindness that day had also been lying to her, carefully and convincingly, perhaps from the very first sentence he ever spoke to her in that dusty chapel. She did not yet know which parts of what Marcus told her had been true, and which parts had simply been useful to whatever purpose he was still serving. What she knew, sitting alone in a parked car with a flash drive in her lap and a funeral scheduled for 2 days from now, was that she could no longer afford to trust anyone completely, including the very people who claimed to be helping her survive. She confronted Marcus the following morning, meeting him again at his own insistence, though this time she brought the video with her, playing it on her phone, the moment he sat down across from her, at a corner table far from any window. His face did not register surprise so much as a kind of resignation, the look of a man who had expected this moment to arrive eventually, and had simply hoped it would come later than it had. He admitted, without much resistance, that he had once worked directly for Everett, helping design the financial architecture that made this entire scheme possible in the first place. The shell companies, the beneficiary changes, the slow siphoning of assets that had taken place over months rather than days. But somewhere along the way, he claimed, his role in the plan had curdled into something he could no longer stomach. Once he understood that Everett intended not merely to fake a death, but to arrange a real one. He said he had tried to walk away quietly, hoping his absence would slow the plan down without drawing attention to himself, and that meeting Amara at the chapel had been his way of trying to make something right without exposing his own earlier involvement. Amara did not fully believe him, not completely, but she also recognized that his knowledge remained more valuable to her than her suspicion of him, at least for now. Marcus was not, however, entirely honest even in his confession, and the next thing he told her landed with a different kind of weight altogether. Everett, he said, had not been the architect of this plan from the beginning. He was, in Marcus's own words, closer to an instrument than a mastermind, pressured, and eventually controlled by a group of financial partners who wanted to seize control of the company Everett had spent years building, using his desperation and his debts as leverage against him. Amara's assets, spread across land and accounts that had remained untouched by Everett's business failures, represented the final piece these partners needed to complete their takeover cleanly, without a messy public dispute over ownership. She asked him, her voice steadier than she felt, why any of this required her death specifically, rather than simply forcing Everett to sign the assets away through some ordinary legal maneuver. Marcus answered that a living wife could contest a transfer, could hire her own attorney, could simply refuse, but a dead one left behind, only grief and paperwork that nobody thought to question in the weeks following a funeral. It occurred to Amara, sitting there, that perhaps nothing about her marriage had ever been accidental, that even the earliest years, the small kindnesses, the wedding itself, might have been built on calculations she was only now learning to read. Marcus led her afterward to a storage facility on the edge of town, one Everett's family had used for years to archive old business records, and among the boxes he pulled a folder dated to the exact month of Amara and Everett's wedding 12 years earlier. Inside sat a witness signature on one of the original marriage documents, a signature Amara recognized instantly despite its age, the same careful, looping handwriting she had seen on countless prescription pads over the years. It belonged to Nolan Pierce, which meant the doctor's involvement in her life had not begun months ago when the funeral was arranged, but had apparently existed quietly since the very beginning of her marriage. Before Amara could fully absorb what that meant, the storage unit's door creaked open behind them, and Everett stepped into the light, no longer bothering to pretend he did not already know exactly where to find his wife, or how much she now understood about the life he had built around her. He did not raise his voice, and he did not reach for either of them, which somehow made the moment more unsettling than any outburst could have. He simply stood in the doorway with his hands loose at his sides, studying Amara, the way a man studies a problem that has finally become too large to solve quietly. He told her, in a voice stripped of every ounce of the tenderness he had offered her the night before, that she had always assumed he married her out of love, and that assumption, more than anything else, was what had made the last 12 years so easy for him to manage. Amara looked at him for a long moment before she found her voice, and when she did, it came out steadier than she expected. She asked him plainly then, what exactly he had married her for. Everett answered without hesitation, without even the courtesy of softening it, and said simply that he had married her for what she had, not for who she was. The words landed the way a physical blow might, sudden and total, and Amara felt something in her chest finally settle into place, a grief that had been circling for 2 days finally arriving at its destination. But grief was not the only thing that arrived with it. Beneath the hurt sat something colder and far more useful, a clarity she had not possessed 12 years earlier, when she agreed to marry this man in a small chapel, not unlike the one where Marcus had first warned her. She understood, standing among dusty boxes with her husband blocking the only exit, that survival now required her to stop reacting to what Everett wanted and start deciding deliberately, what she wanted instead. Friday arrived exactly as the paperwork had promised it would. The chapel Everett had booked weeks earlier, filled with mourners who believed, without a shred of doubt, that they were there to bury Amara Bell. White lilies lined the aisle in careful arrangements. The same recent photograph from the hotel room stood framed near the entrance, and a printed program listed a schedule of remarks from friends and colleagues who had genuinely loved her, none of whom had any reason to suspect the woman they were mourning was at that very moment watching them from a small room adjoining the chapel's rear hallway. Everett stood near the casket in a dark suit, playing the role of the grieving husband with the same fluency he had brought to every other performance of their marriage, his voice cracking at precisely the moments an audience would expect it to. What none of the assembled guests knew, and what Everett himself did not yet suspect, was that Amara had spent the previous 2 days assembling a case against him with the same careful precision he had once used to isolate her financially. One document, one testimony, one recording at a time. Gideon Shaw, a private insurance investigator, Marcus, had quietly brought in once his own credibility, with Amara had been restored through demonstrated action rather than words, had spent the last day and a half compiling everything the group had gathered into a single, undeniable file. Celeste had turned over the original hotel security footage without hesitation, footage that placed Marcus, the mysterious stranger, and Everett together at specific, time-stamped moments no innocent explanation could account for. Vivian had produced the email chain confirming the funeral had been arranged before any staged or real death had occurred, evidence that the entire tragedy had been scheduled with the same casual efficiency as a corporate merger. Nolan had submitted his falsified medical preparations, along with a signed statement admitting his role, choosing cooperation over the far heavier consequences that awaited him otherwise. Marcus, working to atone for whatever role he had genuinely played, supplied the complete financial trail, linking every shell company back to Everett's signature, and, crucially, to the names of the partners who had been pressuring him from behind the scenes all along. All of it had been sent, simultaneously and irreversibly, to the appropriate investigators only minutes before the service began. Everett had just begun his eulogy, his voice performing grief with practiced skill, when the heavy chapel doors at the back of the room swung open and stayed open. Every head turned at once, and the sound that moved through the room was not a gasp so much as a collective intake of breath that seemed to empty the space of air entirely. Amara walked down the center aisle in a plain gray dress, not the black of mourning, her steps unhurried, her eyes fixed only on the man standing frozen beside her own casket. Everett's face drained of color so completely that for a moment he looked more like a man attending his own funeral than hers. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough that only he could hear the first thing she said, though she made no effort to keep her voice low. "You were right about one thing," she told him. "Amara Bell did die." She let the silence stretch just long enough for the words to settle over the stunned room before she finished the thought, her voice carrying now to every pew. "The woman you controlled for 12 years died the night you told her to leave this hotel without explanation? And what is standing in front of you now is someone else entirely." Behind her, on a screen Gideon had quietly wheeled into position near the altar, the evidence began to play, email after email, transfer after transfer, the recorded voice of her own husband, promising a woman named Vivian Cross that by Friday, his wife would no longer have the chance to say anything at all. Everett tried to speak over it, tried to call it fabricated, tried the old smooth denial that had worked on boards and investors and once, for 12 long years, on Amara herself. But his own recorded voice continued playing behind him regardless, unmistakable, undeniable, filling the chapel with a version of the truth no performance could talk its way around. 2 officers who had been quietly seated near the back since the service began stood and moved forward before he had finished his sentence, and the sound of the chapel doors closing behind them felt, to everyone still seated in stunned silence, like the final page of something none of them would ever fully understand. Amara stood very still at the center of it all, watching the man she had married taken out of a room built to bury her, and somewhere beneath the shock she still felt, one question remained stubbornly unanswered. Whoever had truly been standing behind Everett, pulling threads he was too desperate to resist, had not yet been named, and Amara understood that finding that person would be the last piece of a story she was only beginning to write for herself. In the weeks that followed, the investigation widened far beyond anything Amara had imagined, standing alone in that hotel room with a black cloth in her hand. The financial partners who had pressured Everett from behind the scenes were eventually identified through the records Marcus had supplied, their names surfacing in filings that made headlines in circles far removed from the quiet chapel where the truth had first come apart. Everett faced a long list of charges that included fraud, conspiracy, and attempted concealment of a felony, each one stacking on top of the last, until the man who had once controlled every account in their marriage could no longer afford his own legal defense without selling what little remained in his name. Nolan cooperated fully once the investigation began, offering testimony that helped investigators trace how long his complicity had actually lasted, a fact that ultimately shaped the leniency he was later granted. Vivian, having handed over her evidence before anyone forced her to, was treated by prosecutors as a cooperating witness rather than a co-conspirator, a distinction that likely saved years of her life from a courtroom. Marcus accepted responsibility for the portion of the scheme he had helped design, choosing to face those consequences directly, rather than disappear the way he once might have. And Amara found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she respected him more for staying than she would have if he had simply vanished with his conscience intact. Amara did not return to the marriage, not even for a single conversation beyond what the courts required of her. She also resisted the pull toward a kind of revenge that would have cost her more than it ever returned, choosing instead the slower, steadier path of rebuilding what had been taken. She recovered her property one filing at a time, working with attorneys who had no loyalty to Everett's name to reclaim it. She restored her reputation publicly, correcting the false financial narrative before it could calcify into rumor. She told the truth plainly, without embellishment, to anyone who asked and to several who did not, until the story that had once been written for her by other people belonged entirely to her again. There were harder days woven through that period too, evenings when the silence of living alone felt less like freedom and more like an echo of everything she had lost alongside Everett, the shared holidays, the easy division of chores, the comfort of a familiar voice in the next room, even when that voice had turned out to be lying to her for years. She did not pretend those feelings away, or rush past them for the sake of a tidier story. She let herself grieve the marriage she had believed she was in, even while she refused to grieve the man who had actually been standing inside it. Grief and clarity, she learned, could sit in the same room without canceling each other out. What mattered most, in the end, was smaller and quieter than any of the headlines that followed Everett's arrest. Amara came to understand, slowly and without ceremony, that her worth had never actually depended on the man who once tried to schedule her death like an appointment on his calendar. She returned, months later, to the very hotel where everything had begun, walking the same corridor she had once stood in shock, past the same elevators, toward the same room where a black cloth had once covered her own photograph. The room had been cleared out entirely by then, repainted and rebooked, holding no trace of what had happened there. No folder, no frame, no name that had once belonged to her husband. Amara set a different photograph on the small table near the window, one she had chosen herself this time, an image of her own face caught mid-laugh at something no one else in the frame could see. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window for a long moment before she spoke, her voice quiet but entirely her own. "You once prepared a funeral for me," she said to no one in the empty room, to the memory of a man who was no longer there to hear it. "But you never accounted for the possibility that I might live long enough to watch you lose everything instead." Outside the window, the same view that had greeted her 12 years earlier on countless anniversaries stretched out toward the water, unchanged and indifferent to everything that had happened inside these walls. Amara realized she no longer needed the room, or the hotel, or the version of her life that had once depended on a man who saw her as an asset to be managed, rather than a person to be known. She turned, crossed the room without hurrying, and pulled the door shut behind her with a soft, final click. Everett had once believed he was arranging his wife's funeral. In the end, the only thing that was truly buried that Friday was the version of Amara Bell who had once believed silence was the price of love.